We're going to be interviewing Dale Crittenden this morning. Dale is a Navy veteran from World War II. He was born in January of 1923. He was a first-class petty officer and a cook. And it says this interview is taking place on Tuesday, February 1st, 2011 at the Fairhope Public Library in conjunction with the Veterans History Project. And my name is Jim Damico, and I am a colleague of Dale's. And we're going to ask Dale a few number of questions to get started and some biographical information. Well, I know when you were born, but where were you born?
I was born in Fostoria, Michigan,
Okay.
which is in the Thumb area of Michigan.
And what were your parents' occupation at that time?
Well, at that time, shortly after that, after I was born, when I was 4 years old, my father was killed in a train accident.
Oh, dear.
So my mother, with her 5 children, moved to Mount Morris, Michigan, which is a suburb of Flint, Michigan, 3 or 4 miles from Flint, Michigan. And that's where I was raised. I went to school at St. Mary's Catholic School and graduated when I was 17. And I got a job in a bakery for $8 a week. And that's about 5.5 days a week. So times have changed a little bit. So later on, I got an offer from a buddy who owned a gas station for me to go work for him. I tripled the wages, but that still wasn't very much. So in November, a cousin of mine who was very close to me joined the Navy. And I took him down to the recruiting station in Flint to get the transportation so he could go to Detroit to get to his boot camp. And the petty officer there said, hey, you want to join the Navy? And I says, I kind of think I'd like to, because I was fascinated by the Navy over the years. And he says, come on over here. And he stood me on a platform and measured my height, and he says, I'm not sure you can make it. And the other guy said, just grab a hold of his hair, which he did, just pulled me up a little. So I was qualified there. So I took the necessary papers home to my mother to approve of it. And a week later, I was on a bus to Detroit and later a train to Newport, Rhode Island, where I was in boot camp. Now, one thing was interesting to me is that when they recruited me and signed me up, he says, now you're going to boot camp, and that's a training place for recruits, for 6 weeks. And he says, then you'll get a 30-day leave. I said, that sounds pretty good. Well, I joined and entered Newport training camp on the 2nd of December, 1941. And we did the usual things for, marching and guns and things like that. And on the 7th of December, we had a break at noontime. We were in our bunks, and an officer came in and he says, Pearl Harbor has been bombed. And we looked at each other and said, where's Pearl Harbor? We had no idea what it was all about. But that's the day the war started. So instead of 6 weeks in boot camp, I was out in less than 30 days. And about the 1st of January in 42, I know I was on board the ship before that because it was New Year's Eve and us boots couldn't go ashore. And the crew come back drunk, so I can remember that occasion as New Year's Eve. And anyway, I was assigned to the USS Madison, which is a destroyer, or Benson-class destroyer. And it's commonly referred to in the Navy as a tin can because when it's out at sea, it's bobbled, just like a tin can. It'll roll when it's tied up at a dock. So I was assigned to that ship, and perhaps a week later, we went out to sea with Argentia Bay, Newfoundland. And I stood watch on the forecastle. Now, the forecastle is the pointy end of the ship. And it was cold. This is in January in Newfoundland. And I stood watch of the forecastle, an anchor watch, they call it. And I've never before or since been as cold as I was that night. So anyway, that was one stop on this tour. What Madison was doing, most of the American Navy at that time, was escorting convoys of ships of supplies and oil and that to Europe, and especially, particularly to Britain. So we took a convoy to, the first stop was in Iceland, Reykjavik, Iceland, and dropped off some ships or picked them up, and then we continued on to Londonderry, Ireland. And the convoys are, then the particular ships go to various ports of call. And we were there probably a week or so, and then we started back to the States, again escorting a convoy. That's primarily what we did for those many years. And so after that, we probably in February or March, we went over the Atlantic again, and now we're avoiding subs at that time, submarines. We dropped depth charges. Every trip I've been on, for 10 trips across the Atlantic, we dropped depth charges to fend off the submarines. But when we got to back into Europe, we were put with the British fleet to help them do something, which was to get some relief to Malta. Malta is a island in the Mediterranean, owned and occupied by the British, but it was being bombarded very much by the Germans because they wanted to occupy the whole of the Mediterranean. If they closed up Gibraltar, of course, it would affect the war very much. So we went there with a contingent of American ships as well as the British, an aircraft carrier, and they launched planes, Spitfire planes, which is the British main fighter plane. And then we came back out of there and went back into Scapa Flow, which was a big British base in the North Atlantic. And there we stayed with the same contingent of British ships to look for a German battleship, which is the Von Tirpitz. It was in Norway. They'd traced it to Norway, and they didn't want it to get out into the Atlantic or devastate those convoys of ships. So we swung around there for a week or two or three. I can't remember all that. But anyway, when they found out where they were, they just blocked off the outlet. And it stayed that way. They kept that battleship in there until pretty close to the end of the war, at which time some Navy frog people went in and put explosives on it and sunk it right there, right where it was stated. Now, and when we came back to the States, we did runs to the Caribbean to escort the oil tankers back into the Europe to get them supply of oil. We get it specifically out of the Caribbean and we pulled into ports in Puerto Rico and Trinidad and such places as that. Then in the fall of 1942, we left New York and went to Africa. We took part in the bombardment of Africa around the Casablanca area to the invasion of Africa. And shortly after, there wasn't much opposition there, but we did have submarines around us a lot. But shortly after that, we pulled into Casablanca, tied up at a pier there. And it was, I don't think it had been 4 or 5 days since the invasion. And we're going on liberty. I remember the British battleship, the Jean Bark, was laying on its side because it had been bombarded by us, primarily by the battleship, the old New York, and I forget the other one, sunk at its pier. So after the African invasion, we came back and we were back for a month or two continued the trips across up and down the Atlantic, escorting these submarines and escorting the ships and protecting them from the submarines. There's one occasion that we were proceeding over to Europe, and 3 nights in a row they sunk one of the tankers or the ships that we were escorting, because that's what they had developed, the wolf pack, and they would set and wait for a convoy, and then they would slip in between the ships so that, and then they would pick them off. 3 nights in a row they did that, but that's all we lost in that 3 ships out of perhaps 40 ships that were escorting.
Did you, by any chance, sink any submarines?
Not to my knowledge. No. We chased one on the surface one night and lost it, but I'm not familiar with us sinking any submarines. Some of the others did, but we didn't. And after that, they continued the same type of thing until we were in Puerto Rico, and I was told I was being transferred to another destroyer, the USS Ingersoll. 652 was her number. And this was a ship that hadn't been commissioned yet, so I went from Puerto Rico back to Boston, where she used to be commissioned, and we commissioned her. She was a little bit larger than the Madison, but not much. And we did a shakedown cruise in the Atlantic, and on board was Admiral Ingersoll. He was commander of the Atlantic Fleet, and the ship was named after his son, who was a hero out in the Pacific. He saved another ship or something and was killed. So they named the ship after his son. And we did a shakedown cruise, that is getting the ship ready for action, or take all the kinks out of it before it's ready to go into battle. We went through the Panama Canal, up to San Diego, and then out to Honolulu, Hawaii. And in late October, early November, we left there and went and took part on the Marshall Islands campaign. We were attached to the 3rd Fleet, which was a carrier fleet, and battle wagons. And their goal was they would go in, bombard a particular area, and then come back out. And they were destroyers. It was a tremendously big operation. And the Marshall Islands at Kwajalein, that's where first time we ever saw any real action on the surface. And the planes would come in and we would fire at them before they'd get in range. But they did quite well, and the invasion was a success. After that, I think it was, I'm not sure of the order of it, but we went to the Marianas, or Saipan, and we bombarded there, and then there was an invasion of Saipan, and that was probably a very bloody shore, taking care of that island of Saipan. And then it was Guam and Tinian. There was 3 islands there in the Marianas. During that particular period, we had spotted the Japanese fleet, and the aircraft had taken off and gone after the fleet. And it was a large Japanese contingent. And they were taking off, say, at 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm not sure. And they come back, refuel, and go do it again. Ultimately, they were doing it way up into the dark. And at that time, I suppose throughout the war, you've been court-martialed if you lit a cigarette on top side after dark. But planes were coming back so fast and short on fuel that they lit up the whole fleet, put all the lights on that they could, so those planes could get on and land safely. And they since then referred to it as the Marianas turkey shoot. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's common or not, but I remember it as the Marianas turkey shoot.
I think it's.
And they had destroyed some 300 planes in that.
Yeah.
And we during that period weren't under attack to any extent, but we picked up a lot of our pilots and their crew, because some of them were ditching. They say, I'm going down, and they'd be within 100 feet or 500 feet of the carriers, and they just couldn't go any farther. So we spent the rest of that night picking up, we probably picked up 18 or 20 crew members that had splashed. And there was other destroyers doing the same thing. So following that time, that was in probably spring of 1943. No, 44.
44. Okay.
I had left the Madison in 43. Ingersoll was commissioned in August of 43. So this was 44. And we went down to the South China Sea. And during that time, we had we bombarded Formosa, which now is called Taiwan, but it was referred to as Formosa at that time. And during that time, the cruiser Houston was hit with a bomb or torpedo or some such. And she was put under tow by another cruiser, the Boston. We escorted her away from the Formosa. And we escorted the Houston for about 4 days. Mm. And the Japs were trying to sink it. Time after time they'd come out. Well, they did. They finally got a torpedo in her. And we took on, I don't know, 200 perhaps of the crew. And and the Boston took some. But anyway, they picked them up. And a strange thing happened later here in Fairhope or Mobile relative to that, Houston. I was at a Mardi Gras ball in Mobile and talking to a friend of mine who I'd known ever since I lived here, a guy by the name of Cary Grant. Many people in Fairhope know him. He's an automobile dealer. And we got talking, what did you do in the war, that type of stuff. And I told him I was on the Ingersoll, and he said, yeah. He says, I was on the Houston. Oh, I says, we took some of your guys off, and we never knew it, but we'd taken him off the ship and put him on the Ingersoll for a short period of time. And since then, we've become quite close because of that particular occasion. And after that, I think we went up to Iwo Jima and bombarded that before the invasion. And after that, the invasion of Iwo Jima, we went back to San Diego for an overhaul. We were there for 60 days, and I got my 20-day leave, which is the first one I'd had. And that recruiter promised me I'd have 30 days in 6 weeks. And this was like 2.5 or 3 years. It was all of 3 years before I got that leave. So then we headed back out to the Pacific after 60 days, and that was at the time of the invasion of Okinawa. And we were put on what is referred to as picket duty. That was we would be placed out between the Japanese mainland and Okinawa, which is way south of Japan, to intercept the planes that were coming off and bombarding the beaches. And that became quite a thing when the Kamikazes started operation in full. You'd see a number of planes going overhead, maybe 20, 25 planes. And then 5 or 6 of them would peel off and come down on the picket duty destroyers. I don't know how many destroyers are out there, not many, 3 maybe or 4. And they would dive on us. And now over that course of that battle, Okinawa, I think, if my memory serves me, there was about 80 ships hit by the Japanese using kamikaze tactics. And it was a very successful thing. Of course, it cost them lives, but they trained those pilots at that time, and they were getting a little bit fanatical. They would just train them to get out there and hit. They didn't even have to train them to land or come back. Yeah. Just take off and point them. So that became a...
Yeah, did any of those kamikazes come near your ship?
Pardon?
Did any of those kamikazes
No. Well, we had one that came down and he clipped off a yardarm that was sticking out for the communications.
Yeah.
And knocked that off and then splashed right there alongside of us. And it was a kid that was up there and he had earphones on, he jumped over the side when he saw that. Now we're going at a good clip of speed. He jumped over the side, and when after the plane had crashed and that, we turned around and picked him up. And the skipper came on and he says, you know, Charlie or whatever his name was, I thought about court-martialing you for leaving the ship without permission. But then I think that you need to be commended because you're the only one on this ship that had a plan of defense. and that was Captain Blue, and he's quite a good guy. So let's see, where were we at? Okinawa. So that went on until June, and we went back to Ulithi and come back again to join the Third Fleet. Well, the Third Fleet was based in Ulithi, and we started attacking Japanese mainland. We would do bombardments. The planes would come in and hit them, and then whenever it was when the atomic bomb was hit, Nagasaki is one of them, and I forget the name of the other, but 2 days in a row or within a few days of each other. We were out there at that time, and they were, when that happened, and then on the 15th of August, the Japanese asked to surrender. Of course, that was great jubilation on our ship and every ship in the fleet, I'm sure. So then after that, we proceeded to go into Tokyo Bay, Sagami-wan, the river going into Tokyo Bay. And the river was relatively narrow. When I say narrow, it's probably a quarter of a mile wide, something like that. And all along the banks were the emplacements, the Japanese guns and stuff like that, and they had white sheets on them, so that it was a surrender deal, but that was what they had already established to protect themselves. So then the surrender took place in the Missouri there, and we were laying all the way from Missouri, maybe, I don't know, 1,000 yards or something like that. And they signed off on the peace, and I came home. I was one of the first persons off of our ship. There was about 10 of us left, because at that time there was a number, points they called it, people accumulated in the service for how many days they were in combat, how long they were in the Navy and that. So I had those coming out of my ears. So I had a lot of points. I got discharged in, we took a cruiser, took a battleship from Japan, and then a cruiser to Portland, Oregon, and then a train to Chicago, Great Lakes, and that's where I was discharged.
We're in Chicago?
Chicago.
Okay.
And right after that, I went to school at Michigan State. I was in school by January. I got home about, November, 1st or 3rd of November, something like that. So I was school and stayed there till I got my degree. Since then, I've...
Very good. Since you did leave, when you did leave the Navy, have you made any contacts with some of your shipmates?
Oh, yes. This is a continuation of the Houston story. As a result of my seeing Cary Garner here in Fairhope, the Houston had a reunion group, and he went up to their previous reunion, and he volunteered to be the chairman of their reunion to be held in Mobile. And he contacted me and asked me if I would help him on it. I did what I could. He wanted me to be the master of ceremonies at their banquet, which I agreed to do. And they invited all the Ingersoll crew that they had names for to come to their reunion. Well, we didn't have any, we had a mailing list of a few people that we knew, and we sent out a letter to all of them. I provided them with the addresses I could get to, and there's a fellow in Washington, D.C. who was writing a book about us, so he had some names. I think we invited about 20, that's about the number of names we had. And there was 8 of us that showed up for the Houston reunion over here in Mobile. So we started our own reunion group. But Carrie Garner came to almost every one that we had. That was the Ingersoll group. So then someone, my cousin of mine saw a newspaper article that the USS Madison was going to meet in Selma, Alabama. And my cousin's up in Michigan. He called me. He says, "Hey, the Madison's having a reunion in Selma, Alabama." So I called the number, and they were having a reunion, but the chairman was in Selma, Alabama, George Vickers. But they were having a reunion in Arkansas. So then that group grew, and we just had their 25th anniversary, reunion anniversary last October, and it's going to be the last one because there's 5 of us left. So, and the Ingersoll, because it was a newer ship, fought in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, so they had more people. But as far as the World War II group, we had a reunion in San Antonio, Texas last September, and there was only 5 from World War II that put that ship in commission. So Ingersoll reunions will continue, but the Madison's dead. But it's great. We've made some great friends with them from all over the country.
Well, how has some of the your experiences affected your later life as far as your naval experience is concerned?
I don't know. I've gotten a lot of satisfaction out of it, but I've just the fact that, well, number one, I could never have gone to college without the GI Bill. Mm-hmm. I was the only one in my family to go to college, and even the high school where I went, there was very few that went to college. So I think that's the very best thing that happened to me relative to that. And then the friends that I've made that are all over the country through the reunions of those 2 ships. And a destroyer is a small ship, relatively, 275 to 300 crew. Well, you stay with 300 guys for 2 years or a year and a half. You get pretty close. You get to know them quite well and know about their families and their girlfriends and their wives and all that. And that's what we do when we go to reunions. Just keep talking about those different things. So,
well, that's great. Well, we certainly appreciate your coming in and giving us your experiences during World War II, and it sounds like it was an exciting time. And it's, I mean, you had varied experiences, but you served in both theaters of war, which was Europe and the Pacific. So I think that's you don't see many veterans who can do that. But that's great, and we do appreciate your coming in and talking to us about it.
Well, I'm honored that you asked.
It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure, and we really, can't thank you enough for what you did.
Okay, thank you. I hope the program will be a success.
Oh, I'm sure it will be. People like you can't help but miss. You got it. Anything else?
That's it.
I guess.
Oh, thank you.